Hey folks, welcome to Snowpal Software Development and Architecture Podcast. Our guest today is Andy Hilliard. Andy is the CEO of Accelerance, a leading global software outsourcing authority and author of the new book, Synergia, a blueprint for building effective, globally distributed teams in the new era of software development. We're going to have, we're going to talk about a bunch of topics with Andy, but before we get started, Andy, thanks for taking the time to have this conversation here.
Thanks, Krish. Really happy to be talking with you today.
Same here. Before we get started with the topics, if you could just, give us a brief introduction about yourself, your company, and your new book, that would be awesome.
Sure. Wow. Brief. Okay. That's the hard thing. So I've been in the industry now since the mid 90s. Started with Cognizant. I was actually, when I joined Cognizant, they were a recent spin out of Dun and Bradstreet. And they spun out the company because there was so much demand, globally for software development and services, and they just happened to have a very mature, captive group that they thought that they could turn into a business unit, which today is somewhere around 300,000 professionals in Cognizant. Actually, FYI, my son actually is a senior consultant at Cognizant. I'm not sure I should say that, given the fact that I'm in the industry. But anyway, he works on the West Coast. And so I started as a division manager, one of the first American hires for Cognizant in expanding into the U.S. market. I was a division manager of the Southeast U.S. This was back in 1997. And again, they were 700 engineers and very few, if any, clients. So it was really a land grab at the time to make a name for yourself. And actually, I just watched the Cognizant golf tournament on TV this last week, and so they've definitely matured into a big advertising mega brand and a tier one service provider, obviously, over the years. So in the 3 years that I was there, they grew from essentially 700 to 20,000 engineers across basically all facets of clients, small, mid cap, large cap clients. But when they reached 20,000 and they went public, obviously, in order to maintain their growth, they had to focus more on the Fortune 500, Fortune 1000, 2000, those companies that are looking for literally thousands of engineers to alter their software engineering and product development model. And I just had an idea in my head at the time, after reading books like The World is Flat, Thomas Friedman book, Competitive Advantage of Nations, and having been a Peace Corps volunteer in Costa Rica back in the late 80s and early 90s before, an MBA, I thought, this is taking off. This isn't slowing down. There's great developers everywhere. Why not, try to grab a piece of this pie and create a alternative, competitive, differentiated business model by going near shore? So essentially, I quit my job, went to Costa Rica, where I knew, generally speaking, the brand of Costa Rica was very, very, good in the U.S. Who hadn't heard of Costa Rica, wanted to go to Costa Rica, been to Costa Rica. It's just a great, near shore option. Obviously not the supply of engineers that India has, but I wasn't trying to necessarily, become a Fortune, 100 company overnight. I just thought more of a lifestyle, could build a company of a couple of hundred people. So in the next 7 years, we built a company of about 300 software engineers. And I founded that company in 2003. I sold it in 2009. And during that journey, I also discovered that there's increased continual demand for global software development, a very heightened and growing demand for nearshore software development, specifically with my target audience, right? Small mid-cap companies that needed sort of more control, more alignment, more proximity, time zone alignment, communication. Again, I wasn't aiming at the Fortune 2000 companies, so I wasn't really playing in that realm. My ICP was generally these small mid-cap companies that wanted a more close relationship with a firm that they could also trust, and was basically leveraging a lot of the same best practices as a Cognizant, just happened to be on a magnitude much smaller and more more easy and comfortable to deal with. So because of what I saw, I said I wanted to build a network that was complementary or adjacent to my business in Costa Rica, not necessarily competitive, but complementary. So we happen to focus on like fintech and Microsoft, .NET and Microsoft services, and but there's many other verticals, many other tech stacks, and I started traveling throughout Latin America. That turned into Eastern Europe, and that turned into Asia. And that was really the genesis of Accelerance is finding those small to mid-sized development firms, between like 100 and 2,000 engineers who each had a very unique attributes around them regarding application types or vertical expertise or technology stacks, having similar size dynamics, but having those sweet spots, those combination of attributes that would make them unique and complementary to one another and not competitive. That way I could sort of fill in this mosaic of demand in the marketplace with specialists who I had vetted as being sort of cream of the crop in their particular size and segment, fully vetted and certified by us. That's really become Accelerance.
That was a great introduction. I have plenty of questions, actually. You touched upon a lot of topics that are near and dear to me. So in no particular order. So let me just,
Sure.
get started there. And towards the end of the podcast, we'll, talk, please, we'll take the opportunity to talk about your book as well. But many things you mentioned. Nearshoring, let's talk about it a little bit. You mentioned time zones. I've had I've been working in the industry for a long time as well. So, it's just the nature of the beast. You work with people from different parts of the world. It's one of the niceties of being able to build software. Over the year, like maybe 10, 15 years ago, while all of my work experience has been in the US, I've had the opportunity to work with engineers in other parts of the world. But go back 10, 12 years or so, it was predominantly people in South Asia, right? It's India and that part of the world. But in the last 5 years or so, I've seen that change where I've had the opportunity to work with people, engineers, I say engineers, I use that loosely. I just mean folks who make up a software development company, all stakeholders. I've had the opportunity to work with folks not only in Europe, but also in Latin America, and in different countries in Latin America. And I've actually thoroughly enjoyed the experience. But in your mind, and I know a little bit about Costa Rica because I have a friend who used to live here, who moved there and who builds homes in Costa Rica and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
If you could just tell us, what are some of the fundamental differences? Ultimately, let's say you took two engineers who are both building software, and I keep saying engineers, but I just mean any stakeholder. Are there fundamental differences in how problem solving works when you go hire an individual in Latin America versus, say, Europe, you mentioned, versus Asia? Or since it's binary zeros and ones, it's actually normalizable, if you know what I mean?
Sure. Well, I can tell you working with engineers in Latin America is incredibly similar to working with engineers here in the US in the way they communicate, set expectations, assume responsibility and accountability, which isn't to say, of course, that engineers in other parts of the world don't do that. They just approach it differently. For example, I mean, I think it's well known in Asia, there's a culture of overtly sort of pleasing or projecting what a client wants to hear.
Yeah.
There was a blog post that sort of blew up about 6 or 7 years ago that we put out. The 7 ways an Indian engineer says yes.
Well, I'd love to read that.
Well,
I want to say no problem might be somewhere in that list. No problem.
I don't know if it's politically correct now or if it just opens it up for just the balance, the weight of people looking to pick a fight and parsing the meaning or the intention of the article in the right way or the wrong way. It certainly wasn't meant. We do quite a bit of business in Asia and in India specifically. So it was more just to point out that people in different cultures communicate or translate their culture differently when working with other people. For example, engineers in Eastern Europe tend to be very blunt. They tend to take a very strong opinion on what the client is doing, and will not parse words in regards to whether they believe it's the right approach. And in fact, some of their work will be either positively or negatively affected based on their own opinions as to whether it's right or wrong. They're just very clinical and very direct as far as how they take information, how they interpret it into the work product that they end up delivering back to the client. Latins tend to be very American-like, very conversational, and having a certain degree of debate, but also respect in the communication with they take to one another more naturally, I would say, in regards to how Americans feel and how and when I say Americans, I mean we're a mixed salad here, so I'm genericizing the term Americans. But when I'm thinking of the end client and how naturally they go in and how much appreciation and understanding and flexibility one has to have in regards to the way they operate individually and how they communicate with others, it's much more comfortable and natural with
it's spot on, right? I was just going to do the Indian bobblehead, so you wouldn't know whether I'm saying yes or no or maybe but I don't even do that very well, actually, to be honest with you. But I think those are great points because it is important, right? When you're actually building a team, and again, there's two ways to look at this, at least in my opinion. If you're engaging a team for a project 3 months, 6 months, a year, there's a certain element of learning that you would need to have, but how much or what the extent of that learning might need to be is going to be dramatically different from you actually working or setting up a team in a country for long periods of time. Not so much on an engagement basis, but you're going to be building products for indefinitely so. So I think it's simple. I've had this conversation with more than one guest in a different capacity. Like we've talked about remote work and the challenges of remote work. This is, even though we don't call it remote, I mean, offshoring is literally remote work, even pre-pandemic, post-pandemic, whatnot. So it's important to understand the cultures to an extent. So what advice would you give to an organization that's like, you know what, I have a 6-month gig, a project. I need to work with a company, a team in Latin America or maybe in Costa Rica, or I want to work with a company like India, for instance. And a lot of times I see, Andy, that the companies don't take the initiative to, again, I understand why, to learn the cultures, because you don't have the time or the bandwidth or the money to do that. You just treat it as, hey, write some code, get this working and go. But that tends to fall flat. So what is your experience in what works and what doesn't work in having such engagements?
Well, first and foremost, if you're talking a 6-month engagement, so the Accelerance business model is actually not engaged in 6-month engagements. It's helping companies sort of transform their ecosystem of product and software engineering that has continuity with relationships, continuity in model. So you're not dealing with 6-month, end-to-end projects. You're not dealing with waterfall or throw it over the wall type of, outsourcing or offshoring work. You're dealing with transforming your development and product development ecosystem and creating a sort of a one-shore, we call it a one-shore culture. If you're dealing with 6 months, I mean, there's really not much you can do because you are time strapped, and it is defined, and maybe you just don't have time, and you can either spend your time developing or spend your time building relationships, which takes away from development time, and you if you're locked in on developing X over a short period of time, there's really nothing you can do. You have to do what you can do. I mean, you only have certain parameters to work with.
Correct.
But in general, even if you are dealing with a relatively short period of time, my overall emphasis is, especially today, that clients are distributed and service providers are distributed. And I think two things are happening with service providers. One is they don't have a co-located ecosystem of which they can more effectively build a culture that serves the clients in terms of communication skills, in terms of team dynamics. On the other hand, distributed people are exposed more and more to Western culture on a daily basis through all other channels. So they're getting their training in different ways. They're just not getting it in a very consistent manner from a service provider who is ultimately on the hook for providing those services to a client.
Right.
So my overall emphasis is don't offshore for a short period of time, and you have to double or triple your emphasis on team dynamics and team building, accountability, forming teams, normalizing relationships across teams, appreciating cultures, treating everyone as equals, and creating that ecosystem that is truly borderless and cultureless as you can. Do you have time to do that in 6 months? Not really. So you have to pick and choose, what you're able to do with the time frame and what your end in mind is in regards to leveraging offshore.
Makes sense, right? I have a couple of related questions. You mentioned distributed teams there. So, two questions. The first one is, are there certain types of positions, and this is not a leading question, that are better suited for offshoring? Now, let me give an example. If I'm building, Andy's like, Krish, I need help. You're located in, say, in Bangalore. Can you build a server-side API, a bunch of APIs for me, be done. Here are the requirements. That's one type of engagement, just a very specific manufactured example. Another example would be a product management or a product ownership role, where you're trying to find out where the company is at from a product standpoint, where the gaps are, where you need to be in the next 3, 6, 12 months or so. Just two positions in a company. I'm just taking two random positions, just something that came to my mind. What my question here is, are certain types of positions, like if I said, hey, Andy, engineering positions maybe are better suited to be offshore simply because the amount of interaction you might need to have in those types of engagements is probably lesser than product positions. Is that being judgmental, or is that, in your experience, have you seen some positions work better from an offshoring standpoint than other positions?
So the short answer is anything could be offshored, but it depends on who you're offshoring it to, where their sweet spot is, where their strength is, how that entity or partner has been built, and what they focus on, and make sure you're not genericizing your need and an offshore partner in general. That's why it's so important to pick the right offshore partner and to understand that offshore partner intimately well as to what they're strong in, what they're potentially weak in, what kind of clients they currently work on, and what they're working on, and what sort of roles they're providing those other clients. Find out, to understand what their leading profit margin clients are, and why are they creating strong profit margin? Is it because this firm has a very strong skill set in attracting and hiring and retaining certain type of developers or roles, whether it's product owners or product managers? Is this something they've done multiple times before? If that's the case, then absolutely outsource it, because they already have a track record. I mean, that's a very non-rocket science answer, but when people go in and start searching generically and get generic answers back saying, yes, we can do this, we can do that, we can do everything, that's where the due diligence really comes in, and you have to do enough due diligence where you have a sufficient amount of trust and verification in specifically what you're looking to outsource, that you can outsource with confidence. So, your question to me was sort of more generic, like
Right.
what can you outsource, what can't you outsource? And the answer is you can outsource anything, but you have to find and validate and vet the service provider you're getting into a relationship with and understand
Okay.
what they're really good at.
Makes sense. The other aspect, part of my question is, do I, again, this is all by experience. It's none of these questions are manufactured. I promise you. It's just
Sure.
me having lived that life as well. Um, when we talk about offshoring and giving, hey, I need help with doing X, Y, and Z, and I need somebody else to do this for me. I have a bunch of questions there, but to kick this off, there's two ends of the spectrum, two examples here. One is I know what I want. I'm familiar with my expectations and needs. I know what the outcome should look like, not just the end result. It's not like I need a React page and the page should have 3 buttons and it should do X, Y, or Z, but kind of the functionality of that, how it's implemented. I have some idea and I choose that as something to offshore. As opposed to, I'm trying to solve a problem, like I'm building something for the restaurant industry, maybe an app. I understand everything about restaurants, how they function. I'm very good at that. I'm in that business, in that domain. But I don't quite understand how software generally is built. Now I'll offshore the building of a mobile app for my restaurant or my a collection of restaurants or whatnot to this offshoring company. Those I know I said too many words. I'm not sussing. That's not my that's brevity is not my forte. But hopefully, I'm trying to get my question across here. There are two different scenarios.
Mm.
I want to get your take on what the challenges are with each of those approaches. I mean, is it safer to offshore what you actually have a good sense of, that you know what's good, bad, or ugly, as opposed to offshoring to actually find help to fill the void, because I don't have anybody to do this for me here. So I need somebody to do it, because each one has its own pros and cons, but I just want to get your thoughts on that.
Well, yeah, each one is unique in its own realm, and they do have their pros and cons. Obviously, if you know what you want and you have a clearly defined end in mind vision of what that is, then offshoring becomes relatively more straightforward. All you're doing is trying to get to X, and then you can interact with your partner accordingly, so that they understand that their input is more about just getting to X, and doing it as efficiently, cost effectively, and with as high quality as possible. The other method, which you're saying, is you're more depending on the partner's subject matter expertise and knowledge and experience in developing things like your less defined vision is. And that requires a different kind of partner, a partner that has more sort of thought and practice leadership, vertical leadership, and experience, where they can lead in the relationship. One thing I would say is that regardless of which model you're going into a relationship with, time and time again, the one thing that clients fail to do is become a servant leader to the service provider, and bring the service provider into a relationship that is where ultimately you're helping the service provider to help you to achieve your own goals. And that is by far the best way, in order to, whether it's through just getting to X, or having a service provider take more of a leadership and ownership role in helping you to find exactly where you want to go and how you get there. It's really incumbent that you empower and you embed and you integrate the service provider into your environment. Why is that so important? Well, because the relationship becomes stickier, it becomes more accountable. The service provider feels more engaged. It becomes more strategic for them, this relationship. And essentially, what you're trying to do as a client is you're trying to surpass the other competing clients for that service provider and become a more value-added client of theirs, which ultimately becomes a higher profit margin client because you have lower turnover, you have more stickiness, you have more developer, enjoyment and happiness, and the relationship becomes more dynamic across different functions of the service provider. This all behooves the client in the end.
Absolutely.
So
But there is this, am I reasonably, I mean, would you agree that there is the higher element of risk in actually offshoring what you don't know? In other words, I'm a restaurant owner. I need an app that I want to use, but I don't know how software is built, and I've chosen to go about it. There is, I mean, the way I see it, there's a higher element of risk, and if you accept that that is true, how should I navigate that as a client? Because the reason I ask this question is I get
yeah.
we are a product company, Snowpal. We build many different products. I have people reach out to me on LinkedIn from different parts of the world saying, "Hey, I can help you do this. I can help you do that." When I have a couple of even on LinkedIn, when I have these conversations, it comes across to me that even the very basic initial questions I would get very unconvincing answers, like super
Yeah,
high level answers
sure.
that kind of gives it away to me, saying, you know what, probably I don't want to spend any more time even having these initial conversations. To the point, I have my real life example of Andy, where I actually engaged with somebody years ago, asked them to help me out with building a server side system, and we had built it in the company. We just needed them to do more of that, so we had a design pattern. We provided the design pattern, and then they had to replicate that pattern. It was appalling. The quality of what the deliverables we actually got were nowhere close. So we couldn't actually use any of it. So it was just, a sunk cost. I mean, wasted dollars essentially. And then as I dug deeper to learn more, I understood that as a service provider, someone told me that, hey, we might actually prefer business clients versus technical clients. And to me, at that point, I wasn't exactly clear what the distinction was, but this is what I learned. A
Sure.
business client is more the restaurant example that I gave you. They are very good at what they do, but they're not in the business of building software.
Yeah.
So they're not going to poke and prod and question every single thing they're not going necessarily looking at the pull requests and looking at the quality of your code, the extensibility or the scalability or the whole the nine yards. The technical client, on the other hand, is going to be pretty anal about each and every item. So I've had people ask me in the recent past, hey, are you a technical client, or do you actually build software for some other client and you just need us to help you out? Because literally they themselves reject the conversation based on that answer, because they're like, oh, if you're a technical client, we really are not interested in being engaged, for instance. So at least that's my experience. I want to get your take on it.
That's really interesting distinction and important distinction. And over the last couple of years, we found that there's typically a major gap in communicating and working with offshore service providers, and that's the role of the product owner. And typically clients are very, even clients don't have a good product ownership role, and they typically don't have a counterpart that has, adequate maturity in product ownership. It's usually just a refabbed project manager who's trying to fill that role, but doesn't really understand or know how to interact with product management or product ownership on the client side. More and more we're seeing clients needing to have a higher level of product ownership on the service provider side, and to shore up their own level of product ownership and how they interact with product management and stakeholders. That is a trend that is growing exponentially right now in the marketplace, because you see a lot of technical service providers, and actually a large trend that's happened over the last few years is the fact that so many service providers with practice leadership, like product ownership, and QA and software engineering, those companies are being acquired rather rapidly by larger tier one service providers or by companies as to become captives, which is if you combine that with the further distribution of resources across the world and the lack of co-location, it really becomes a challenge for companies to outsource to a service provider that has this holistic ecosystem of support in order to lead clients. What you're doing is the world is awash with tens of thousands of overnight service providers that are essentially staff augmentation people of just engineers. There's no practice leadership, there's no thought leadership, there's no business leadership. All it is the transaction of resumes and trying to fill, seats with technical people. And that is why, third parties are coming into the ecosystem to provide those practice and thought leaderships, product ownership roles. And that's challenging for everyone because I think more people are outsourcing, more companies are outsourcing, and they're outsourcing with a lack of service provider leadership, and also the lack of wanting to create a one shore ecosystem. They're really being very transactional, very binary, which is very dangerous.
Andy, that's such an important point. It's a and you said it brilliantly because I think even though everything we've talked about so far is no less important, but what you said in the last 2 minutes to me, in my experience, can either break or make it defines the success, the outcome essentially, because you mentioned that it's easy enough for companies to pop up and sort of fill those seats, saying, "Hey, I have like 25 people who can do this. I have 30 people who can do this." But without all of the leadership positions that you mentioned there, it's very hard for a client to engage those companies because it's extremely challenging. And especially if you're a business client in the context of this definition, sometimes engineers have the tendency to throw words like quote unquote buzzwords out there to not help the cause, to just muddy the waters, because it somehow feels like if I make things sound a whole lot more complicated than they really are, there is a higher chance that Andy might actually give the project to Krish or something like that, right?
It's honestly, Krish, the world out there is scary. It is chaotic. We receive maybe 25, 30 applications a day from new service providers that supposedly have hundreds of engineers and practices. And, we have a pretty efficient manner for spending 30 minutes and discovering how vacant and these companies actually are. They turned up overnight. They have a massive menu of services. They do everything under the sun, which they've used AI to create.
Yeah, right.
They virtually have no FTEs, but they have excuses as to why people don't show up on LinkedIn, et cetera. We know those are all lies. And over the last 4 years, we would track and score around 8,000 service providers pre-COVID, and now we're tracking and scoring about 27,000. These came
Wow.
from nowhere, and it's all smoke and mirrors. It's all white noise into the marketplace, and even the ones, even the 8,000 that we used to score and monitor, a lot of those, having been discovered that they're real and legitimate, have been either acquired or consolidated or have gone out of the marketplace, sold their businesses. And what's left is this massive sea of commoditized combination of real, fake, but everyone is distributed because you don't need co-location. It's a waste of funds and resources, and it boosts your profit margin, I guess, supposedly, and to reduce your costs and your risk when running a business as to not have so many fixed costs. And that is why, it's so imperative for companies to invest more in not just to hand over, a massive investment to a supposed organization, but to do amount of vetting and also to integrate and embed the actual people, whether they're individuals, working out of their homes, or whatever the organization happens to be, you need to invest in bringing them in to your system, your ecosystem. You need to be more proactive about creating that, and not just covering your eyes and throwing it over the wall to, some organization you don't know, you know, you want to trust, but you really haven't reached that level to have trust be
Yeah,
earned.
and Andy, let me go back to what you said. You said 8,000 to 27,000, almost 3x in the last 4 years, right?
In the
So
last 4 years.
it,
It's impossible. It's
and it
impossible in real, how you build a legitimate, trustworthy, organization. You can't do it, but it can be
unless
done. I
it's
mean,
it sounds like the stock market in the last 6 months to me when you're talking 3x, 6x, and 25x of things changing, right? Uh,
it's all smoke and mirrors. It's all like, it's like bot farms. It's like,
but
except
Andy,
this is
the thing is, even just for folks who are watching this or listening to it, 28,000 was not a small number to begin with. In other words, it's not the problem to me in my mind is not so much the 3x growth in the last 3 years that make things more complicated. I actually want to say that even prior to this growth that you're mentioning here, things were pretty complicated, because how do I go pick somebody who can help me? And I can speak to this with direct experience as a product company that's been building software for like years. So we know exactly what we want because we do it all. We just need staff augmentation, if you will. We're not expecting architecture or leadership or anything of that nature because we have that here in the US. But even with that, the challenge I've seen is, let me take, I come from India. So I'm just going to take India as an example. India is a large country, right? I think it's the fifth largest country in the world, if I'm not wrong. Uh, there's a lot of cultural differences in the country. It's a very rich, diverse nation.
sure.
There's many different languages. So, there's a lot of things that, how do I tell? I come from the southern part of India. And how does it matter? It's remote, it's offshoring. So I could just go find somebody anywhere in India. Perfectly understandable. But when you're talking remote work, when you're talking communication, when you're talking understanding cultures, uh, it helps to know who you are working with, what the culture of that particular part of the world is. Now, you cannot take a brush and paint a broad stroke saying, okay, I've learned India in general, so no matter whether I'm going to work with a company in West Bengal or whether in Tamil Nadu or whether in like Gujarat, things are going to be identical. Not
Right.
even close. But the problem, I think the challenge I've seen is, when you're not from India, living in a country, you've never been there or haven't had much to do with that nation, it's natural as humans to sort of generalize things, saying, yeah, I know it,
Absolutely.
I know this. But when you dig deeper, it's almost like saying, when somebody calls me to get help from the West Coast of the US from the East Coast, within the first 60 seconds of that call, I could almost place if the call's coming from Seattle or Boston or like, I don't know, Philadelphia, for whatever reason. In India, I think it's just even more profound. This is a big challenge, even for somebody who actually knows the states and the cities and whatnot. How do I, as a company who's located here, I'm this restaurant owner in Texas, and I say Texas because I actually talked to somebody who owns a ranch in Texas who reached out to me, who's a brilliantly smart guy, but not a software person. And he shared a few experiences with me over the years that actually, some good, some not so good, about the offshoring experiences. How can a client understand? I'm not even talking short term and even long term engagements. How do I dig deeper? Where did the folks who work in this organization go to school? Where did they go to college? I mean, I'm not saying colleges define everything, but all of those things kind of matter to some extent. For me to make a quantitative analysis and a judgment and a weightage to saying, hey, this company I would rate a 90 out of 100 quantitatively. The other one I rate a 78, so I'm going to go with a 90. I'm not seeing clients do that. It's very subjective decision making.
Clients
And if
aren't
that
doing that.
happens,
It's an American fixation on outsourcing means efficiency in cost, efficiency in work, efficiency, and in this business, because it's more about art and relationships. It's collaborative. It's people working together, hopefully, in blended teams. I'd say 98% of our clients will spend time overseas with prospective partners before they select a partner. They will spend time, at least every 6 months going overseas. And that sounds inefficient, but really the philosophy is you have to go slow to go fast. You can get a lot of benefits out of it. In fact, you can multiply the benefits beyond what you probably thought you could get if you spend more time in building relationships, building trust, creating radical candor, creating commitment as a team, making sure everyone's accountable. They feel like they're a part of something as opposed to a transactional widget. So, I mean, this doesn't sound very technical, and sometimes it doesn't sound very efficient, but it actually leads to better technical results and more efficiency if you spend more time in gaining the commitment of an organization, of the individuals you work with, and building a level of trust so that they feel like they're producing for you because it means something for you and for them. And nobody wants to break a relationship once you create something that you find is fulfilling you both personally and professionally. You're creating that. That's why it's like this servant leadership. And we always have this philosophy of anytime you get into a relationship with an offshore service provider, you want to make sure you're somewhere between the second most important client and the ninth most important client. If you're the first most important, you probably have too many eggs in the basket. There's too much at stake. And if something goes wrong, everything goes wrong. And if you're number 10 or 11 or 12, human nature runs on a prioritization system. We try to prioritize things, and you're not getting enough attention. You're not getting enough A players. You're not getting enough, just enough of all the goodness that you want. You want to be strategically important. And in order to do that, you need to make the effort to be that. You need to be that servant leader where you know your development resources, your team, you're showing up. And you know what they say, 90% is showing up or something like that. You're making the effort. People appreciate you. You appreciate them. I mean, this really gets back to my Peace Corps days. The 3 goals of Peace Corps you think would be, the goals would be go in there and get stuff done. But that's actually the 3rd goal. The first goal is to go in and learn and gain an appreciation of your host country nationals and how they live. I mean, we're there for 3 years. We need to establish trust and candor and commitment. We're not there throwing money at a problem and trying to fix it overnight. So you have to appreciate the other culture. You have to understand the other culture. And then you have to share your culture and execute or translate a degree of appreciation and understanding of your culture with your host country nationals. And the 3rd goal is to accomplish, I was in fisheries and ceramic associations. I was helping companies sort of grow from nothing to something. So I was a business consultant. But in order to do my end in mind results of consulting and growing businesses, you had to establish trust and accountability and appreciation and understanding. And then that smooths the gears to work together so much more effectively. And people feel more fulfilled because of it. And they stick and they're working for something, not just for, the day or the shekel or whatever.
You know what, Andy, I couldn't agree more. I'll give you an example. One of my guests, his name is Prasanna, who's traveled to every country in the world. He mentioned something exactly along the lines of what you just said. Yeah. He said that, he went to China, to Beijing on a project. And then he was leading a large team, and he would ask questions in a meeting saying, hey, what do you folks think? And he would not actually, nobody asked any questions. This happened day 1, day 2, and day 3 till he figured, something is not right, because I'm sure people do have questions. And then he told me, he shared, I'm paraphrasing what he said when he was during that episode. He said that the culture was, it was not considered respectful to actually ask questions in a meeting until people asked you, pointed out specifically saying, hey, Andy, do you have a question for me? Or, hey, Krish, do you have a question? So he, articulated this better because he lived that experience. But it's exactly the point he made was he needed to understand the culture. It was not just like go there, day 1, be effective. It is not going to work that way. You're going to have to know the people, sort of socialize outside of work before they actually become comfortable enough to even ask you those questions. They had those questions in their minds. they just never came forward with those questions, which is literally, what you told earlier makes complete sense to me.
Yeah. Yeah.
So we're at, and I have a lot more, and hopefully I can, we have more. I hope to have more of these conversations because I have a lot more to ask you.
Sure.
But since we have only a couple of minutes left, do you want to tell us a little bit about? I'm going to include the links so folks can, I'm going to include all of the links that Andy shared with me, including a link to the book. But if you could just take a couple of minutes to just help us understand a little bit about the book and what we would get from reading the book, that'd be great, Andy.
Absolutely. I appreciate that, Krish. So a lot of what the book focuses on is what we sort of talked about. It takes the reader through the evolution of software and product development outsourcing, and how it began, the pre-pandemic, post-pandemic, how radically different it is today, and how you need to apply different strategies in order to make it work for a company. It seems like just yesterday that we were pre-pandemic, and it's really hard to change the way we think things are supposed to work. We still do things in a pre-pandemic mode, thinking they're going to work today. But as we know, as we see all around us, industries are changing very rapidly, and the outsourcing industry has changed historically and dramatically. 3 times the number of vendors. What does that mean? A lot less product and thought leadership and product leadership and that type of leadership from service providers. Well, what does that mean for me? Should I not outsource? Well, no, you can definitely outsource and create relationships, but the way you approach it has to be radically different. That doubling or tripling down on cultural alignment, team alignment, the philosophy of creating a single ecosystem, so that you're not dependent on necessarily a binary service provider relationship. You're creating an ecosystem that serves both the service provider, because it provides a system that is typically more long-term, more functional, more embedded, more integrated, and that works holistically better. So, the book really outlines, models, and it brings in, actually, the book itself has 10 experts, 10 thought leaders and practice leaders who have a lot of decades of experience each, in outsourcing, and they've experienced the evolution itself. And each expert thought or practice leader is, bringing a different perspective on, how to build teams today, how to make them most effective as quickly as possible, how to create, more sort of dynamic relationships that pay off both short-term and long-term. How to make everyone more accountable, how to, integrate product ownership and product management and DevOps into, the larger ecosystem, not just engineering. How to move beyond the transactional software engineering mentality of the past and move into the definition of sort of value flows from engineering all the way up to stakeholders. These are things that need to be rethought, and they need to be rethought today, because doing things the way pre-pandemic is a sort of a recipe for disaster, and the world is much more difficult. You might think people are sort of convinced that it's easier to deal with because they have these platforms to define service providers, and they have these PEO firms in order to engage resources. But it's almost like a Pandora box. It's become, it gets opened, and now you have the tools in order to dig your own grave. It's just become much more. It's much more opportunistic if done the new way, and it's much more dangerous if done the old way.
Yep, awesome. I know we're at the top of the hour. I was just going to share my screen and show your company, but I don't know. Do you have a couple of more minutes, or should we?
Sure. My time is your time.
Okay, let me just share my screen here. Okay, do you see my screen, Andy?
Sure.
Okay, so this is Andy's company, Accelerance.com. So just I want to capture that as part of the podcast. So folks, remember, I'm also going to include the links So definitely, check out Andy's the company website, and also the book. I have the link. I'm going to include it. It is available on Amazon, so folks can purchase it on Amazon. I saved the link, but it's on a different window actually. Now that I think about it, but I will include the links here so people can check out your services. And if they have any questions, Andy, I'm going to include your LinkedIn is the best way to reach you through sort of hitting you up on LinkedIn.
Yeah, sounds great, Krish.
Okay, awesome. And before I end the podcast, so for folks who don't know our company, Snowpal is a product company. We build many different products. Most recent launch was our APIs on AWS Marketplace. So if you're building services for yourself, products for yourself or for your client, and if you want to go to market sooner rather than build everything from scratch, you can actually use our APIs through a subscription-based model, or you could license the APIs and run them in your own infrastructure as well. The idea is to give you all of the building blocks, so you only actually work on building parts of the solution that are very unique to your customers and not necessarily doing all of the groundwork or reinventing the wheel. That's basically one of the many things we do. Podcasting has been a recent experience, so thank you so much, Andy, for taking the time.
Krish, you should actually think about going into podcasting full time. You have a very approachable conversational manner about yourself. So I don't know if you're an introvert by nature.
No, I'm not. No, I'm not.
But you need to talk to more people and more groups than you even currently do, because actually you put people at ease, and that's a
I
skill.
really appreciate that. That's so kind of you. I never did a collaborative podcast. I was just doing it, and then one of the people who I work with, his name is Ben. He's a very nice guy. He lives in Seattle, and he was like, "Krish, you should actually, collaborate with other people because you might enjoy it." I'm like, Ben, I'm not even sure. What if I do something stupid?
You have a very natural listening and inserting and flow to the way you communicate with people. So I don't know.
It helps, and it helps because I try to, when people are smarter than you don't have to do anything, right? So it's easy. You bring people like yourself into a podcast. I don't actually have to do anything. All that I ask is a question, and then, the answers are so spot on. The only thing I try to do is not try, even though my inclination is to interrupt, because sometimes when you said so many things, my eyes lit up because they were spot on. But I realized that by interjecting, I might actually ruin the flow of thoughts of the guest. So I actually hold my expressions back. So I would be a little bit different in person than in a podcast. But that I really appreciate.
Well, you don't just ask questions. Actually, you listen intently, and your questions are very progressive. They're naturally progressive in the flow of things. So your ability to maintain attention, to listen intently, and to move the conversation to the next level, and not go off in a whole different direction. That's a skill set.
Thank you so much. And folks, I'm going to take the compliment shamelessly. I don't get too many of those all the time, but this was a great conversation. I have a lot more questions. I'm going to sort of bug Andy to hopefully come back. And if I don't do a bad enough job, I've seen that guests are all right to show up again, because I have so many items that you mentioned. I actually want to take each of them and dig sort of deeper, because I think it'll be extremely useful. And hopefully it doesn't cannibalize. People should certainly buy the book. All of these conversations are in addition to what what they read in the book, because this is them sort of visualizing the expressions and whatnot, in addition to what they can certainly learn from the book itself. So again, accelerance.com. I'll include the links. Andy Hilliard, thank you so much. Andy is the CEO of Accelerance, a leading global software outsourcing authority, and author of the new book, Synergia, a blueprint for building effective, globally distributed teams in the new era of software development. And I think we all need to understand this because the world's growing, it's globalized. We need to know how teams and companies and cultures work in different parts of the world to be successful. We are sort of a hub as the US, and we're going to need people to help us from different parts of the world. So I think this book is, as much as this conversation, I think the book is very contextual. to things that we have to learn so we can not make those mistakes, or at least reduce the number of mistakes that we actually
Couldn't have
do
said it
end up
better.
making. Yeah. Thank you very much, Andy.
Thanks.
Talk to you soon.
Okay, take care.
Bye bye.